All right, everyone, I want to thank our sponsor today, Organifi. You know, we talk a lot on this podcast about healing and the healing journey. Well, an integral part of that are the foods and the drinks that we consume. I know you know this. If you're like me, you know the importance of eating healthy, but you don't always have the time or the willpower to cook with all the colors of the rainbow. Organifi's superfood blends make it easy and enjoyable to add more variety and nutrition to your day. These are delicious organic powders that you can add to water or milk, stir and drink. It literally takes 30 seconds. It is that simple. A couple weeks ago, I was right about to start a green juice fast, a kind of a short mini fast. And I kid you not, the night before, Organifi reached out to me about sponsoring this podcast. And I will tell you that I was thrilled because this is aligned with what I'm doing. I'm familiar with Organifi. I've used them in the past before. I want to be able to bring to you quality products and things that are going to promote a healthy lifestyle. Organifi green juice is the one I use. It's the one I use every morning so that I know right away I'm starting the day on a healthy note. It's loaded with vitamins, loaded with minerals, and essential antioxidants. As a listener of the Trauma Therapist Podcast, you can get 21% off any item by going to Organifi.com/trauma and use the code trauma. Once again, to get 21% off any item, go to Organifi, that's Organifi.com/trauma and use the code trauma. All right, everyone, I want to thank our sponsor today, Organifi. You know, we talk a lot on this podcast about healing and the healing journey. Well, an integral part of that are the foods and the drinks that we consume. I know you know this. If you're like me, you know the importance of eating healthy, but you don't always have the time or the willpower to cook with all the colors of the rainbow. Organifi's superfood blends make it easy and enjoyable to add more variety and nutrition to your day. These are delicious organic powders that you can add to water or milk, stir and drink. It literally takes 30 seconds. It is that simple. A couple weeks ago, I was right about to start a green juice fast, a kind of a short mini fast. And I kid you not, the night before, Organifi reached out to me about sponsoring this podcast. And I will tell you that I was thrilled because this is aligned with what I'm doing. I'm familiar with Organifi. I've used them in the past before. I want to be able to bring to you quality products and things that are going to promote a healthy lifestyle. Organifi green juice is the one I use. It's the one I use every morning so that I know right away I'm starting the day on a healthy note. It's loaded with vitamins, loaded with minerals, and essential antioxidants. As a listener of the Trauma Therapist Podcast, you can get 21% off any item by going to Organifi.com/trauma and use the code trauma. Once again, to get 21% off any item, go to Organifi, that's Organifi.com/trauma and use the code trauma. Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 422. Welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to help support and inspire new trauma workers through this podcast and my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0. Thanks so much for joining me today, and here we go. This episode is sponsored by Somatic Experiencing. Trauma may be a fact of life, but it doesn't have to be a life sentence. Somatic Experiencing is a psychobiological method of addressing clients' physical and emotional trauma conditions and helps to give voice to their experiences without a need for them to retell their story. SE focuses on regulation of the nervous system and offers the opportunity to engage, complete, and resolve the body's instinctual responses to traumatic experiences. For more information regarding somatic experiencing and the SE professional training program, the Trauma Therapist Podcast listeners can visit traumahealing.org/TTP. TTP. That's traumahealing.org/TTP. All right, guys, this episode is sponsored by Trauma Therapist 2.0, community to educate, support, to inspire new trauma healers. If you're a new trauma worker, new trauma provider and healer, you're starting out on this trauma-informed journey and you're tired of doing this alone and looking for support, looking to be around a community of other passionate trauma clinicians, I invite you to check out Trauma Therapist 2.0 at traumatherapist2.com. That's traumatherapist2.com. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Gary McPherson here. Very excited to have as my guest today, Mark Walsh. Mark, welcome.
My pleasure to be here.
All right. So Mark is the founder of the Embodied Facilitator course, Embodied Yoga Principles, the Embodiment Podcast, and the Embodiment Conference, a groundbreaking event attended by over 15,000 people worldwide. With an honors degree in psychology, 20 years of yoga experience, and a keto black belt, he's dedicated his life to embodied learning. These days, he teaches and mentors young embodiment teachers all over the world. 15,000 people.
Yeah, we did an online conference, and I thought a couple of thousand might turn up. And I got enthusiastic about it, invited a few friends to speak. We ended up at 140 speakers, and then 15,000 people turn up. And
wow.
It was great. And also went much deeper than we thought. I didn't think you could go deep with an online event, but it was great. And this year we're doing it again, and we're going for 150,000 people this year and 1,000 presenters. And it may be the largest educational event in human history. We're not sure, but we haven't heard of a bigger one.
Wow.
And it just, you want to get the word of embodiment out there to the world. I got a beautiful message just a few days ago from a yoga teacher in Iran. And I was given the politics at the moment. I was really touched by this. And she said, hey, I've just got your free resources. It's so great because we can't actually buy anything in Iran on the internet using credit cards. But, the economic embargo, they can't just go online and buy a course. She said, I'm really working my way through all this embodiment stuff. I'm going to share it with all the yoga teachers I know in Iran. And thank you so much. And I just thought, wow, this is great that we're able to reach such corners of the world.
Very cool. Well, we'll talk more about the event and so forth. But first, share with the listeners where you're from and where you're calling from. And let's dive in.
The reason I speak funny is because I'm from England. And I grew up near Cambridge, which people have probably heard of. But I've lived all over the world. And I've worked in about 50 countries. So my accent's got a bit weird because I've been traveling the world teaching embodiment. Yes. Originally, my background was Aikido, and then I moved from there to many other embodied practices, yoga and dance and Feldenkrais and different things.
Okay. Well, let's talk about how you got into, first of all, let's talk about how you got into this embodiment, what it is, and what kind of pulled you into this topic, this field.
Yeah, desperation. And failure. So when I was a kid, I was really clever cognitively. And people said, you've got IQ in the top 0.01%. And I'd read every book in the library, literally every book in my high school library. And yet I was miserable, suicidal, drug and alcohol addicted, was failing in all my intimate relationships, my sort of teenage intimate, first relationships. And I kind of thought to myself, if I'm so smart, why am I so miserable? Why is my life such a mess? And I realized there must be something else. There must be something more than cognitive learning. And then when I went to university, because of what I was involved with at the time, I wanted to learn a martial art. And I walked into Aikido school. And it was something very different than the normal education of sitting in rows. It was dynamic, and there was this Asian element, and people being thrown around, and there's beauty and discipline and breath. And I was like, wow, there's something else. There's another way to learn. And I just threw myself into Aikido because I absolutely needed it to survive. And that was my first love. I became a living Aikido student in various places. But then I realized not everyone would do Aikido, and that no Aikido, like any art, doesn't have the whole picture. So I started studying other things and brought that to the business world, humanitarian world, to coaches, to yoga teachers, and spreading that. I found it so valuable to come home to the body for our own well-being, but also for our relationships, for the planet, that I've made it my life's work really to put that out to the world.
What was it, if you don't mind me asking, that kind of fueled the thoughts of suicide for you?
I'm on the therapy podcast, aren't I now? I should be asking that for mom next. I really was so disconnected from myself that I was a stranger in a strange land, to use a little bit of poetry. And that's the root of, that's disembodiment, right? Mm-hmm. Being disconnected to oneself. And also I wasn't able to self-regulate. So any emotions I did have were overwhelming. So hence addiction, hence alcohol. Like, okay, this I can regulate with this, as we see that connection with trauma and alcohol so often. I grew up in a house with an alcoholic father. I write about this freely in my book. And I talk about, let me just say this in the first person. So there was a point where I checked out of my body as a kid and went, this is overwhelming, definition of trauma, overwhelming experience. I don't want to be here. Let's get out of here. Mm-hmm. And that was, that numbing from those childhood experiences. And then later on from war zones, I kind of got a second hit, as it were, disconnected me from who I was as a person. And that there's a tragedy in that. And some very practical issues like the not being able to self-regulate and the addiction and, there's other practical things.
Okay. I appreciate you sharing that. I mean, I think what it really does is kind of give us a context into what you almost needed to do, what you had to do, and how you are thriving in this context of being embodied and so forth. So what was the next step for you? How did you create this embodied movement, if you will?
Yeah, well, I think there's a wave that's been going since the 60s, and it's had a sort of resurgence recently in a slightly different flavor. For me personally, I did Aikido, and then I was invited to assist on a peace project with the United Nations on Cyprus. So Cyprus is split down the middle, like Berlin used to be. And there's a northern side with a Greek side, a Turkish side, and a Greek Cypriot side. And in the middle is a no man's land with the UN. And there was a project that brought people from different warring countries together using Aikido. And this is a kind of crazy idea, right? Like I'm one of the people in charge of like there's Iraqis and Americans, there's Serbs, there's Greeks and Turks, there's people from Israel and Palestine, of course. And everyone in this room is like, badass. These are all pretty hardcore martial arts people. And I was like, wow, this could be a really bad idea. But it actually turned out to be a very, peak experience, one of the highlights of my life. And in that, I was introduced to trauma work. So there's a teacher called Paul Linden, who I really recommend, who's an Aikido teacher, who's a trauma expert. And he works with abused children. And he invented the field of embodied peace building, pretty much. And, well worth getting on the show. And Paul was there and he introduced me to said, hey, look, Aikido is great, but not everyone's going to do Aikido. But there's some really good stuff in it, like the centering exercises or, the embodiment, the body awareness. There's other ways to get that out to people. And there's a guy called Richard Strozzi Heckler there who was doing it with business leaders. And I basically kind of interned with these guys and became obsessed with like, okay, yeah, it's great to throw people around, but not everyone's going to do that. So how do we get this rich body of learning out to everyone? And then I just got obsessed with that. And I also spent a few years working for a nonprofit in various areas of conflict. And that it gave me another reason to be interested in trauma as well, actually, there was sort of being on the sharp end of things, as it were. So I've, I did some work in East Africa, the slums of Brazil and Afghanistan, different places. So, I don't do so much of that anymore. My mum is a lot less worried about, where I take my trips these days. And when I got married, I was married in the Ukraine, and that was, I actually met my wife in there's a war in the Ukraine not a lot of people know about. It's basically a proxy war with Russia. And she was my interpreter. And I was a setup because they couldn't really afford to keep paying me. So I was put on a train and the people that were there were like, look, we can't afford to keep bringing you back, but why don't you get to know your new interpreter? And you've got 8 hours on a train, but nothing to do but talk to each other. And it's an extremely beautiful, smart, wise woman was, that came in. And it was a setup for her too. She had no idea what was happening. She's like, why am I being asked to interpret for this job? And, 3 days before our wedding, I was working with soldiers in the Ukraine and sharing what I knew. So I still occasionally do a little bit there. And the Russian gay community as well, I've been fairly involved with in Moscow for the last 5 years as well. And there's just a lot of trauma in that community. There's a few little bits from my life.
I appreciate that. So the Embodied Facilitator course, what is that?
So that's for life coaches and trainers. So what we realized was most trainers and coaches, therapists, yoga teachers, they know the body matters. They know embodiment is important. But there was a need for some really practical, pragmatic learning in that a lot of this field can be a little woo-woo, a little sort of new agey, unicorns and dolphins. And that just doesn't cut it in the business world. Mm-hmm. It doesn't cut it with aid workers. It doesn't cut it with a lot of communities, actually. you know, outside of some of these rarefied hubs like Brighton where I live, or maybe, you know, Northern California or Berlin or somewhere like that. So the Embodied Facilitator course teaches people to work with the body in very simple, pragmatic ways. It's a personal growth journey and also just a set of practical tools. And it takes 9 months. We do it in Moscow. We do it in the UK. Next year, we're going to be moving it also to Berlin and to New York. So it's a growing community of people, really. Mm-hmm. I love how diverse it is as well, because you'll be there and there'll be a yoga teacher and a business executive and a top comedian. And, you know, it's a really diverse group of people that come on it. And it's wonderful to have a community of people for whom embodiment is normal. Mm-hmm. And who we can learn as a group. So, you know, I value that community very highly.
But let's, if we can, talk a little more specifically. What does that mean? I mean, to be embodied within this facilitator context.
So, I mean, first things for people is to build their own body awareness. So, if we're talking about embodiment, there's, you know, most people are disembodied to some degree, right? So, coming back to their own body, they get a practice, they work on that, developing their own embodiment, and then simple tools, you know. Like I could lead a centering exercise, for example, now, if you like, which is one of the simple tools they would do. And they do this centering exercise with a coachee before asking, you know, a busy coachee comes in and they're hyper aroused and crazy from the day. And then they just settle them down with a 1 minute centering exercise. And then they say, what do you want to get from today's session? Mm-hmm. You know, as a life coach might. So these practical tools are the things they often value. I mean, I don't know if you want me to lead one, if you want to do something practical for a minute.
Sure, we can do that. I just want to kind of highlight here, I think the reason why I wanted to have you on here is because, you know, becoming embodied is something that is crucial for therapists working with trauma. Also, a lot of times people get into this field as a therapist or counselor or psychologist, whatever, you know, to help others, to heal others. And yet they soon find that, wait a minute, I've got to do my own work, you know. And just as you were saying, you were kind of disembodied as a younger person. Oftentimes that journey of becoming embodied is a journey. It requires a lot of exploration, a lot of kind of gut-wrenching, soul-wrenching investigation sometimes. So, it's challenging sometimes for people to say, wait a minute, I've got to do my own stuff. I've got to become embodied to help this other person.
Yeah. I mean, the helping professionals, whether it's aid workers or therapists or coaches, are, you know, full of people who it's like, the problem is them. They're the screwed up ones, and the vulnerability gets sort of projected onto the other. I'm fine. It's my clients that have a problem. And yeah, sometimes there is a little bit difficult or a bit awkward almost when we're like, yeah, but let's start at home. Let's begin with self-awareness. Let's build that muscle of embodied self-awareness. Let's develop a solid embodied meditation practice, a solid movement practice, and, you know, just have that as a foundation for working with others. And definitely, you know, we'll get a group of therapists and they'll want to talk about embodiment for a long time. And I'm like, it's like going to a restaurant and eating the menu, you know, like we need to do some stuff here. And that does take a little time and work and community, but it needn't be gut wrenching all the time. You know, it can be a lot of fun as well. We use dance and improv and different tools that are,
sure.
You know, the embodiment world is broad, and body therapy has one part that's really good, and then improv, and then there's dance and yoga, and all these different elements bring something really valuable, and they focus on a different area. So some breadth is often helpful without getting provincial about, you know, it has to be Aikido or it has to be dance movement therapy or whatever it is.
Nice. Okay. So let's talk about the book.
I have quite a lot of ADHD. And I found it very hard to sit and write a book. But I kept writing social media posts and blogs. And the best ones someone kept in a file. And eventually they sent me it and said, you should turn this into a book. And I said, okay, so we'll do that. And it was like my lists and top tips about embodiment and top 5 things to know about trauma, like really quick win. Some things you could read on the toilet, you know, you could just go, okay, people are busy. I wanted something, not a big heavy tome, but something practical. And then people said, hey, it's good, it's useful, it's readable, but it's a bit dry. So I added a bunch of stuff from my life. And it was, you know, love stories and stories of trauma and war and my dad's alcoholism. And that kind of gave it a bit of a personal quality. And we added some poetry, which kind of spiced it up. And I realized if you were going to write about embodiment, you couldn't just write about it dryly. You had to evoke it. So it's a funny kind of book because it's got poems and stories and autobiography, but also lists and more technical kind of lots of diagrams of what different arts bring, and the different 4 types of embodied intelligence and this kind of thing. So it's an interesting book. It's quite small. It's pretty readable. It's sold pretty well. I'm happy. It seems to be getting out there now. So Embodiment, Moving Beyond Mindfulness. It's now out there, and happy to have a book out. It's for someone that's done a lot of virtual stuff, to have something solid in my hand like that was a nice feeling.
Just a reminder, talking with Mark Walsh. He's founded the Embodied Facilitator course, Embodied Yoga Principles, and Europe's first embodied business training company, Integration Training. We'll have everything linked up at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. So you talked about Richard Strozzi Heckler, who was a previous guest here on the podcast. When I talk to you, Mark, what I'm getting is you seem to be bringing a lot of different resources to the work you're doing. What do you feel you're doing? And even what do you want to get out there that maybe differentiates yourself from what other people are doing in this field?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. So one is the fact that I'm a generalist, so I'm interested in the breadth of this field. And through things like the podcast and the conference and my own obsession with trying different things and, doing Feldenkrais today and then 5 rhythms the next day, getting some sense of the breadth of the field, because it's confusing. Mm-hmm. And not just a sort of postmodern mess, but actually to make sense of it and say, who would I suggest do yin yoga? Who would I suggest not do yin yoga? If someone comes to me and they have a trauma background, what sort of things would I might suggest they keep away from, or how to find a good Aikido teacher if that's their background? So how to understand the diversity and breadth of the field. There are better Aikido teachers than me. There are definitely deeper therapists than me. I'm not a therapist, There are people that are more experienced meditators. But the breadth of this field, I think how it integrates, that's one strength. And I'd say another one is teaching. I'm really a teacher. I'm 3rd generation teacher, way more than 10,000 hours of teaching, and teaching embodied work in a clear, accessible way. So one of my students made me a t-shirt that said Unicorn Slayer on it. And their idea was that I was sort of not saying things that were new age, or, I can talk to soldiers and business people, or, people that are just no nonsense. It's no problem for me because of that practical way of doing things. Because it's, normal people who's maybe their kids are screaming, they've got different stresses. They don't necessarily want to read a big academic book, mm-hmm. or hear the latest sort of politically correct language from the West Coast that's telling them they're bad and wrong for using the wrong words. They just want something practical that can help them. And so I think that's probably a strength of mine, is teaching in a no nonsense way. Cross-culturally, I'm pretty good too, in that I've worked a lot in like Russia and Israel, and about 50 countries now. And I think there are slightly different flavors to these things cross-culturally, and are reasonable at understanding some of those differences. And, I've seen, for example, teachers from the States getting quite a lot of trouble when they try and treat Moscow like it was, Berkeley, for example. Right. And that's not the same environment.
So what is the Embodied Yoga Principles? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I love yoga. I've done yoga for years. My mum was a yoga teacher. I sort of grew up with it, really. And as I learned more about embodiment, I'd be in a yoga class and it would start to seem like a missed opportunity. Because I go, yeah, it's nice to stretch. It's good for our health. The breathing's good for us. That can be useful. But I noticed things like, wow, like why is it that I love warrior pose, but that person next to me has never liked it, even though I've seen them come to this class for years? Or I'd be in forward bend and I'd suddenly forgive someone. And I go, I just totally let go of that resentment I had about them. And then I'm like, oh, maybe I could do that deliberately. Or maybe we could really examine what is revealed through the poses. And then I realized that yoga kind of didn't really cover every psychological archetype that was useful to explore. So we imported some poses from elsewhere. With a group of senior yoga teachers, we invented poses. We have poses like authority pose, for example, you just won't see in a normal yoga class, or joker pose, or sensuality pose, And we're working with these archetypes, and people through the poses can reveal something about themselves. Like, hey, is this familiar? Is this home base? And they can use it for inquiry. They can use it as a self-coaching. So you can be in warrior pose and you can be like, okay, where do I need to be a warrior in my life?
Right.
And what we got very good at, the niche of EY, so you call it niche, don't you? The niche of EYP is that getting yoga off the mat. So it's great to be fit, but who cares about your Instagram and your flexibility? You know, like that doesn't really help your life. How do you use warrior pose with your kids to get into bed, or with your boss to get a pay rise, or whatever it is? And that's what we really specialized in. And I'd say sort of like 90% of yoga people are like not that interested, but 10% are like, wow, they're like, this is exactly what I was looking for. So we teach that in Austin, Texas, and Berlin and UK, and, you know, all over the world. There's a whole bunch of teachers now, and they all use it differently.
You talked about early on kind of being, you didn't use this word, but it almost sounded like you were kind of trapped in your head, you know, dissociated, disembodied. Was this process of you becoming more embodied through Aikido, in a sense, was that a struggle for you to become acquainted with your body?
It was a joy, but yeah, I found Aikido very difficult. It was the first thing I'd ever been really bad at. And I found it very difficult to learn through watching, because I was used to a more Western style. And, you know, I had quite traditional Japanese style teachers. And I was sort of a bit awkward. You know, I wasn't Swan. I wasn't a ballet dancer. I found it technically very difficult. Aikido is not the easiest place to start. And then there's also the emotionally difficult of, you know, like really confronting the emotions. And I remember when I really started getting in touch with myself, and, you know, I'm a working class British bloke. This is just not how I was raised. You know, like I was with one of my teachers in California, and they'd be like, you know, how do you feel? I'd be like, fine. And they'd say, well, what's another word for fine? I'd be like, okay. And, you know, my emotional range was fine, okay, good, hungry, and horny. That was about it. And then the two of those aren't really emotions, right? So it's like I was pretty limited, and it was a little bit painful to come back to like, oh, okay, actually. And that's still weird. Like yesterday I was feeling sad. I'd had a friend get angry with me for something and say, look, let's not be friends anymore. You know, it was kind of annoyed with me. And I was really sad about the loss. And another British person met me in the morning, and they said, hey, Mark, how are you? And I said, you know what, I'm kind of sad today. And she was like, ugh. Like, okay, it's like, oh, she wasn't really asking. It was that, you know, ritual that people do, you know. And she said, what is it? I said, you know what, I don't want to talk about it right now, but, you know, I'm just a bit sad, you know. It wasn't that big a deal, but I remember what it would have been like to have been crushed by that, rather than when I first got into contact with some of those emotions. And now I feel like it's just more part of my kind of emotional landscape. There's more of a rich landscape there. So I'm glad I've made that journey, but it was definitely times when it wasn't always easy. And still now, you know, I just did a 4-day solitary retreat in the woods, meditating, and stuff comes up, you know. Or recently I was in the gym and I was deadlifting, right? And there's a squat with a really heavy weight, and my psoas got released somehow, which, you know, trauma therapy. And all of a sudden I'm like nearly in tears in the gym. And I'm like, it was kind of funny, but it was also like a little bit weird, you know. It was like I'm in this macho environment, and I'm like, oh, I'm kind of welling up, you know. So there's still stuff that comes up like that could be a little tricky or awkward. But yeah, I'm so glad I've made that journey of coming back home to myself. For me, it's yeah, I wouldn't trade that.
I mean, for myself, becoming embodied, or even becoming more self-aware of what it means to be aware of my body, wasn't easy. How do you navigate that when you're teaching that for people? You know, you talked about being comfortable talking with all kind of aspects of people, like soldiers, for instance. How do you teach that? How do you navigate that for people who might not otherwise be adept at that?
Yeah. So assuming people are motivated, so it's linked to something they care about, and you're using language and embodiment, your own embodiment and dress, that's all accessible. So that's the first thing. That's the hygiene factor. The next answer would be slowly, carefully, really big on consent. That's a big deal to me. You know, like I really am not impressed by yoga teachers who go around adjusting people in their classes, for example. So, you know, that's something we teach students, is an impeccability with consent. Strong ethics, communities of support, communities of accountability. I think that's really important to contain that kind of container, to create that kind of container. You know, well-boundaried classes. Like I don't let someone into an EYP workshop who comes half an hour late once we've gone through the confidentiality agreement and all the safety stuff. Like, you know, being able to hold boundaries like that. Having done as much of your own work as you can yourself, you know, but that's ongoing. I still get monthly EMDR, for example, and weekly therapy, as in terms of looking after my own trauma and things that are still there and patterns that come up. So yeah, but I think the consent and calibration are the two main things that I teach beginning students, and I can teach that to a life coach in an hour. When we work with Paul Linden's tissue throwing technique, where you throw Kleenex at people, and it's very safe, it's very accessible. They have a little startle response that's no one's been traumatized by a Kleenex that I know, so it's kind of a pretty safe trigger. And then you work with that, and then you gradually increase or move it to a more realistic trigger if need be. But you can start real gentle, lots of consent, lots of calibration, and life coaches can learn that in an hour. They don't have to become therapists.
Right. All right, so let's talk about this event that's going on. And this is going to be an online event?
Yeah, so we have two online events, part of the same thing. So there's the Embodied Trauma Conference, which is a sort of one of the kind of warm-up events, if you will, to the Embodiment Conference, which is the Embodied Trauma Conference is real soon. So that's the 3rd to the 8th of February online, run by the awesome Karin Bell from Switzerland. She's a colleague of mine. There's various teachers people will know, like Pete Levine and Stephen Porges, and various kind of well-known people who are on there, Lawrence Heller. So people can find that at embodiedtrauma.com. And I imagine there'll be 10, 15,000 people there. So it'd be a pretty big online event. Free to all. Making this stuff accessible is a big part of my life's work, and Corinne's really aligned. And then in October, there's the Embodiment Conference, the full Embodiment Conference, which, is really going to be quite an epic event. And a lot of headliners there that people will know from the trauma world, from the wider embodiment world. Mentioned Strozzi, Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, Pete Levine, Gabor Mate, Stephen Porges, and a whole load of others. There's going to be 1,000 presenters. So it's
wow.
Yeah.
Again, online?
Online, free to all. Free to all.
October when?
The exact dates, I should know this off by heart, but I tend to be more of a visual learner. Get this up. 14th to the 25th of October.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, and if just people Google the Embodiment Conference, they can find it. And it's embodiment, I believe. We just had a new website put up. One moment. It's theembodimentconference.org, and there's all the details there. Okay. And again, free. This free stuff. When people register, they can get involved. They can see all the different speakers, various ebooks, and recordings from the 2018 event that are there. Like Betsy Politin is a trauma teacher I really respect, and we give away a sort of free talk from her and a few other things. So yeah, I'd encourage people to get involved in that. It's one right up soon, and one to look forward to in October.
Awesome. So the Embodied Trauma Conference, what's the kind of the theme there? What are you hoping to get out?
Yeah, well, I think Kareem wanted to make the trauma narrative accessible. So I think it's a very accessible conference, in that we see trauma moving into the mainstream now, away from just therapists and yoga teachers to a more mainstream audience. So I think she really wants to get, she's a mum and she's very involved with stuff with parenting, and just to get it out to normal people in a way. And then there'll be some sort of, masterclass levels around embodiment, particularly for more people like, therapists who are more specialist in the knowledge already. So I think that was her real aim with that. And the body's role in trauma seems to be hot topic. Definitely people are interested in it. So we'll see what that's like.
Awesome. All right, Mark. I'll have these linked up again at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Before we go here, I know you've got a zillion books behind you, but any go-to book recommendations, whether, having to do with anything we've been talking about today or not?
If people are interested in meditation, they should check out Rob Babea's Ways of Seeing, which is advanced level meditation stuff. Rob Babea, who is the main teacher at Gaia House in England, who, because he doesn't fly for environmental reasons, isn't so well known. But if people like meditation, they should definitely check him out. And I want to give a wild card one a little bit as well here, that a lot of people out there who do really good work are just really bad at marketing themselves. They're really bad at putting themselves out there. And I think that's such a shame. So I was just reading Seth Godin, Sethgodin. His stuff on marketing is really accessible. Really, there's marketing for hippies as well. Ted Hargraves, who's great, if you want a more alternative take on it. But Seth's a great place to start. And it's a little bit of a wild card, because I didn't want to sort of name another trauma. Of course, there's Bessel van der Kolk's book and all this kind of stuff. But I wanted to name something a little bit unusual for people, because I think that's it's important that people that do good work are able to get it out there.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely. So Seth Godin, we'll have them linked up, and Rababea, Ways of Seeing. Awesome. Mark, it's a pleasure, man. You're doing it.
I'm out there in the world. Yeah, it's as long as it's fun. And it's, even working with trauma education, I think can be fun. And it definitely means that I meet some interesting people like you. So,
awesome.
I'm aware that we've sort of thrown quite a lot of stuff at listeners and different things. So maybe people will just pick up the threads or whatever particularly interests them. And there's a lot of stuff out there on the internet for free on all these lots of resources there. So, yeah, thanks for having me on the show, Guy. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. But just before we go, your podcast, tell everyone the name of that.
Oh, it's the Embodiment Podcast. Okay. And it's about 220 episodes. And a good number of them are on trauma. For example, we did one on sex and trauma with Chana Cassell. It was great. And David Baselli was on, and various other sort of trauma-related ones people might like. But this is the whole embodiment world. So if people just wanted to survey what's out there, that would be a sort of free and kind of easy way to do it.
Awesome. All right, Mark. Thanks again, man. Take care.
My pleasure. Thank you, Guy.
All right. Once again, thank you to Somatic Experiencing for sponsoring this podcast. Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to resolving trauma worldwide by providing professional training and education in somatic experiencing. It was founded by Dr. Peter Levine, author of the bestseller Waking the Tiger, who developed somatic experiencing based on explorations of how animals deal with threat, nervous system overwhelm, and traumatic experiences on a daily basis. Learn more about somatic experiencing and the SE Professional Training Program at traumahealing.org/TTP. That's traumahealing.org/TTP. All right, guys, this episode is sponsored by Trauma Therapist 2.0, community to educate, support, to inspire new trauma healers. If you're a new trauma worker, new trauma provider and healer, you're starting out on the trauma-informed journey and you're tired of doing this alone and looking for support, looking to be around a community of other passionate trauma clinicians, I invite you to check out Trauma Therapist 2.0 at traumatherapist2.com. That's traumatherapist2.com.